Now, one of the other ways of performing or using the Fetch API is by using async and await. It's not really related to Fetch API in general, but it is related to promises. And you have already seen that we are using promises, we are evaluating promises. Right now, when we're evaluating the promise, we are using .then and .them. And that is perfectly fine. If you want to do that, that's fine. But there is another way, as I'm mentioning, using async and await. So let's go ahead and rewrite the fetch movies function, but this time we'll be using async and await. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and comment it out right here and going to rewrite the fetch movies function. So function fetch movies. And inside the fetch movies, we do have to do the same thing, right? We have to do the fetch and we have to pass in the movies URL. Now, if we want to evaluate the promise, which we do want to, we can use the old technique, which is .them. This is going to give us, it's going to open up the box and give us what's inside the box, what's inside the promise, which will be a response object. And then we will have to do a .then again, as we did it over here. But this time we are not really using .then. We want to use a latest feature, which is, well, by latest I don't really mean it's released a couple of months ago. It's been around for quite some time now. So what we want to do is we want to evaluate it, but we don't really want to use .then. We can evaluate the promise by using simply awaiting on it. And this is going to return it. This is going to go ahead and open up the box and give us what's inside the box, which is response. Right now you can see that if I hover on it, it actually tells you that there is a problem. And the problem is that you can't really use an await just like that on a function that is not marked with async. So the keyword await can only be used on a function that is marked with async. What that actually means is that we have to say async right before our function. Now we have marked or decorated our function fetch movies with async. Now we can await on it. So what's going to happen now? Well, if we go ahead and call fetch movies, and if I go ahead and simply save it, and let's go ahead and console.log over here, the response. You can see that we get the response object. So we're calling fetch movies. It does the same thing. It goes to the OMDB API, it gets some stuff, and it simply displays it. All right. And I don't think it's actually working right now. What is it actually returning? It might be returning correctly because we didn't really change anything. Okay. So it does give you the response, and the same exact thing, if we had to write it using .then, it would be something similar to that. Fetch, which we have already done last time. .then, we'll get the response, and then we can probably go ahead and print out the response. So you can use any technique that you want. I would mostly go now with the async and await because it's more, you can see it's more incremental. In other words, it's more sequence oriented. The code is flowing kind of like in this direction, and you can kind of see what's going on. You also didn't really have to pass any callbacks, which is one of the things that you may notice. In the previous function, we were passing in the callbacks, movies fetch callback, but we didn't really pass anything over here. So this is the response that we get. And you can only use await on things that is going to return you a promise. And if you look at the fetch API, it's right over here. It's actually returning you a promise. See that? So that is why we're awaiting on the promise, meaning we are evaluating the promise, and then we simply return whatever the promise returns, which in this case is a response. So we get the response, we're printing out the response, but that's not what we want. We want the actual movies. So we can call response.json. Whenever we call response.json, which we also did over here, you will see that the response.json is actually returning you promise. But what we want to do is we want to evaluate the promise using an async and await approach. So how do we do that? await, and this is going to return you the movies. I think it's much nicer if you compare the code that you have over here versus the code that you had previously. The async one is much more nicer, clear, compact, and easier to read. Finally, you can go ahead and return movies. So this means that you didn't really have to pass any callback. You can simply go ahead and just return it. Because what's going to happen is that whenever it sees await, it's going to suspend over there. Suspend doesn't really mean that your page is stuck. It simply means that it's waiting for the fetch to return, but on a different thread. So it calls the fetch on kind of like a different thread, and it tries to do all of that task on a different line. All right. Now, once we do the fetch movies, we can go ahead and get the movies over here. And then we can call, I guess, our function display movies is commented out, but we should be able to kind of like copy it. Display movies hasn't really changed, so we can go ahead and call display movies. Okay. And let's see what's going on over here. Movies.map. Okay, so in this case, we are not returning movies, we're returning movies.search, right? Once we get the response, we get the result, and we can say that we are returning result.search, because if you remember correctly, everything is inside the result. Now, if you run this application right now, you can see that I'm doing a fetch movies over here, and then I'm calling display movies, passing in an array of movies, but it doesn't work. It basically says that movies.map is not a function, which is kind of weird because we are returning search over here, and search, if you look over here, is an array of movies. So the question is, what exactly is going on? Well, let's go ahead and print out movies just to be 100% sure that we are doing it correctly. If you print out the movies, it doesn't give you an array of movies, it gives you a promise. So now the question is, well, why is it returning you a promise? Why is it not returning you an array of movies? And the reason that it is returning you a promise is that the function fetch movies is an async function. And when you return something from an async function, that something, an array of movies, is wrapped up, is put in a box, and that box is a promise. So we have to open up the box. How do we open up the box when we are using async and await? We use await. Well, we can't really use await over here because await can only be used inside a function. So we're back to the same place again. But there are a number of ways that you can utilize that. You can create a function and you can call that particular function and whatnot, or you can create some sort of an anonymous function right over here, decorate it with an async, and then you can simply call that particular function. So this is anonymous async function that we have created, and inside this function, we can perform an await. So now if I run this, I get the console correctly, and I also get the display movies working correctly. So everything is working nice. Now, if you don't like the anonymous function over here, you can create your own separate function if you want to, and you can do that also. So that will also work correctly. Okay. So this is what we have. You have learned about async, you have learned about async and await and promises and how they work, and hopefully now you will have a much better idea of how to perform asynchronous calls using the fetch API, using .then approach, but also using async and await approach. So which approach should you use? Should you use async and await, or should you use .then? I believe that async and await approach is much compact, much nicer, much concise, and it's actually used in many other programming languages also. So if you're using Swift or if you're using C#, they also use async and await. So it's a good idea to start using async and await so that you will be also comfortable if you jump onto some other languages that supports async and await behavior.